Chapter 7, Part 1 of Aircraft and Submarines by Willis J. Abbott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Some Methods of the War in the Air. Part 1. The fighting tactics of the airmen with the various armies were developed as the war ran its course. As happens so often in the utilization of a new device, either of war or peace, the manner of its use was by no means what was expected at the outset. For the first year of the war the activities of the airmen fell far short of realizing Tennyson's conception of "the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue." The grappling was only incidental. The flyers seemed destined to be scouts and range finders rather than fighters. Such pitched combats as there were took rather the form of duels, conducted with something of the formality of the days of chivalry. The aviator intent upon a fight would take his machine over the enemy's line and in various ways convey a challenge to a rival, often a hostile aviator of fame for his daring and skill in combat. If the duel was to the death, it would be watched usually from the ground by the comrades of the two duelists. And if the one who fell left his body in the enemy's lines, the victor would gather up his identification disc and other personal belongings and drop them the next day in the camp of the dead man's comrades with a note of polite regret. It was all very daring and chivalric, but it was not war according to 20th century standards, and was not long continued. When at first the aviators of one side flew over the enemy's territory, diligently mapping out his trenches, observing the movements of his troops, or indicating, by dropping bunches of tinsel for the sun to shine upon, or breaking smoke bombs, the position of his hidden battery, the foe thus menaced sought to drive them away with anti-aircraft guns. These proved to be ineffective, and it may be said here that throughout the war the swift airplanes proved themselves more than a match for the best anti-aircraft artillery that had been devised. They could complete their reconnaissances or give their signals at a height out of range of these guns, or at least so great that the chances of their being hit were but slight. It was amazing the manner in which an airplane could navigate a stretch of air full of bursting shrapnel and yet escape serious injury. The mere puncture, even the repeated puncture of the wings, did no damage. Only lucky shots that might pierce the fuel tank, hit the engine, touch an aileron or an important stay or strut, could affect the machine, while in due course of time a light armor on the bottom of the fuselage or body of the machine in which the pilot sat protected the operator to some degree. Other considerations, however, finally led to the rejection of armor. Accordingly, it soon became the custom of the commanders who saw their works being spied out by an enemy soaring above to send up one or more aircraft to challenge the invader and drive him away. This led to the second step in the development in aerial strategy. It was perfectly evident that a man could not observe critically a position and draw maps of it, or seek out the hiding place of massed batteries and indicate them to his own artillerists, and at the same time protect himself from assaults. Accordingly, the flying corps of every army gradually became differentiated into observation machines and fighting machines, or avions de réglage, avions de bombardement, and avions de chasse, as the French call them. In their order, these titles were applied to heavy, slow-moving machines used for taking photographs and directing artillery fire, more heavily armed machines of greater weight used in raids and bombing attacks, and the swift fighting machines quick to rise high and swift to maneuver, which would protect the former from the enemy, or drive away the enemy's observation machines, as the case might be. In the form which the belligerents finally adopted as most advantageous, the fighting airplanes were mainly biplanes equipped with powerful motors seldom of less than 140 horsepower, and carrying often but one man, who was not merely the pilot but the operator of the machine gun with which each was equipped. Still, planes carrying two men, and even three of whom one was the pilot, the other two the operators of the machine guns, were widely adopted. They had indeed their disadvantages. They were slower to rise and clumsier in the turns. The added weight of the two gunmen cut down the amount of fuel that could be carried and limited the radius of action. But one curious disadvantage which would not at first suggest itself to the lay mind was the fact that the roar of the propeller was so great that no possible communication could pass between the pilot and the gunner. Their cooperation must be entirely instinctive or there could be no unity of action, and in practice it was found that there was little indeed. The smaller machine, carrying but one man, was quicker in the getaway and could rise higher in less time. A most vital consideration, for in the tactics of aerial warfare it is as desirable to get above your enemy as in the days of the old line of battleships it was advantageous to secure a position off the stern of your enemy so that you might rake him fore and aft. The machines ultimately found to best meet the needs of aerial fighting were for the Germans always the Fokker, and the Taube, so called from its resemblance to a flying dove, though it was far from being the dove of peace. The wings are shaped like those of a bird and the tail adds to the resemblance. The Allies, after testing the Taube design, contemptuously rejected it, and indeed the Germans themselves substituted the Fokker for it in the war's later days. The English used the Vickers Scout, built of aluminum and steel and until late in the war usually designed to carry two aviators. This machine, unlike most of the others, has a propeller at the stern called a pusher, in contradistinction to the tractor, acting as the screw of a ship and avoiding the interference with the rifle fire which the pulling, or tractor propeller mounted before the pilot to a certain degree, presents. The Vickers machine is lightly armoured. The English also used what was known as the DH-5, a machine carrying a motor of very high horsepower, while the Sopwith and Bristol biplane were popular as fighting craft. The French pinned their faith mainly to the Farman, the Caudron, the Voisin, and the Morane-Saulnier machines. The Blériot and the Nieuport, which were for some reason ruled out at the beginning of the war, were afterwards readopted and employed in great numbers. It would be gratifying to an American author to be able to describe, or at least to mention, the favorite machine of the American aviators who flocked to France immediately upon the declaration of war, but the mortifying fact is that having no airplanes of our own, our gallant volunteer soldiers of the air had to be equipped throughout by the French with machines of their favorite types. After we entered the war we adopted a plane of American design to which was given the name Liberty plane. It may be worth while to revert for a moment to the distinction drawn in a preceding paragraph between the pusher propeller and the tractor which revolved in front of the aviator and of his machine gun. It would seem almost incredible that two heavy blades of hardwood revolving at a speed not less than 1,200 times a minute, a speed so rapid that their passage in front of the eyes of the aviator interfered in no way with his vision, should not have blocked a stream of bullets falling from a gun at the rate of more than 600 a minute. Nevertheless, it was claimed during the earlier days of the war that these bullets were not appreciably diverted by the whirling propellers, nor were the latter apparently injured by the missiles. The latter assertion, however, must have been to some extent disproved, because it came about that the propellers of the later machines were rimmed with a thin coating of steel lest the blades be cut by the bullets. But the amazing ability of modern science to cope with what seemed to be an insoluble problem was demonstrated by the invention of a device light and compact enough to be carried in an airplane, which applied to the machine gun and timed in accordance with the revolutions of the propeller so synchronized the shots with those revolutions that the stream of lead passed between the whirling blades, never once striking. The machine was entirely automatic, requiring no attention on the part of the operator after the gun was once started on its discharge. This device was originally used by the Germans, who applied it to their Fokker machines. It was claimed for it that by doing away with the wastage caused by the diversion of the course of bullets which struck the revolving propellers, it actually saved for effective use about 30% of the ammunition employed. As the amount of ammunition which can be carried by an airplane is rigidly limited, this gave to the appliance a positive value. Reference has been made to the extraordinary immunity of flying airplanes to the attacks of anti-aircraft guns. The number of wounds they could sustain without being brought to earth was amazing. Graham White tells of a comparison made in one of the airdromes of the wounds sustained by the machines after a day's hard scouting and fighting. One was found to have been hit no less than 37 times. Curiously enough, the man who navigated it escaped unscathed. Wounds in the wings are harmless, but the puncture of the fuel tank almost certainly means an explosion and the death of the aviator in the flame thousands of feet in the air. During an air battle before Arras, a British aviator encountered this fate. When his tank was struck and the fuselage or body of the machine burst into flames, he knew that he was lost. By no possibility could he reach the ground before he should be burned to death. A neighboring aviator flying not far from him told the story afterwards. "Jack was not in the thick of this fight," said he. "He was rather on the outskirts, striving to get in, which I suddenly saw his whole machine enveloped in a sheet of flame. Instantly he turned towards the nearest German and made at him with the obvious intention of running him down and carrying him to earth in the same cloud of fire. The man thus threatened twisted and turned in a vain effort to escape the Red Terror bearing down upon him. But suffering acutely as he must have been, Jack followed his every move until the two machines crashed, and whirling over and over each other like two birds in an aerial combat, fell to earth and to destruction. They landed inside the German lines, so we heard no more about them, but we could see the smoke from the burning debris for some time." As the range of anti-aircraft guns increased, the flyers were driven higher and higher into the air to escape their missiles. At one time 4,500 feet was looked upon as a reasonably safe height, but when the war had been under way about 2 years, the weapons designed to combat aircraft were so improved that they could send their shots effectively 10,000 feet into the air. If the aircraft had been forced to operate at that height, their usefulness would have been largely destroyed, for it is obvious that for observation purposes the atmospheric haze at such a height would obscure the view and make accurate mapping of the enemy's position impossible. For offensive purposes, too, the airplanes at so great an elevation would be heavily handicapped, if not indeed rendered impotent. As we shall see later, dropping a bomb from a swiftly moving airplane upon a target is no easy task. It never falls direct, but partakes of the motion of the plane. It is estimated that for every 1,000 feet of elevation a bomb will advance 400 feet in the direction that the aircraft is moving, provided its speed is not in excess of 60 miles an hour. As a result, marksmanship at a height of more than 5,000 feet is practically impossible. In the main, this situation is met, as all situations in war in which efficiency can only be attained at the expense of great personal danger are met, namely, by braving the danger. When the aviators have an attack in contemplation, they fly low and snap their fingers at the puff balls of death, as the shrapnel from their appearance when bursting may well be called. Naturally, efforts were made early in the war to lessen the danger by armouring the body of the machine sufficiently to protect the aviator and his engine, for if the aviator escaped a shot which found the engine, his plight would be almost as bad as if the missile had struck him. The main difficulty with armouring the machines grew out of the added weight. The more efficient the armour, the less fuel could be carried and the less ammunition. If too heavily loaded, the speed of the machine would be reduced and its ability to climb rapidly, upon which the safety of the aviator usually depends, either in reconnaissance or fighting, would be seriously impeded. The first essays in protective armour took the form of the installation of a thin sheet of steel along the bottom of the body of the craft. This turned aside missiles from below, provided the plane were not so near the ground as to receive them at the moment of their highest velocity. But it was only an unsatisfactory makeshift. At the higher altitudes it was necessary, and in conflict with other airplanes it proved worthless, because in a battle in the air the shots of the enemy are more likely to come from above, or at least from levels in the same plane. The armoured airplane was quickly found to have less chance of mounting above its enemy, because of the weight it carried, and before long the principle of protecting an airplane as a battleship is protected was abandoned, except in the case of the heavier machines intended to operate as scouts or guides to artillery, holding their flights near the earth and protected from attack from above by their attendant fleet of swift fighting machines. Of these, the Vickers machine used mainly by the British is a common type. It is built throughout of steel and aluminum, and the entire fuselage is clothed with steel plating, which assures protection to the two occupants from either upward or lateral fire. The sides of the body are carried up so that only the heads of the aviators are visible. But to accomplish this measure of protection for the pilot and the gunner who operates the machine gun from a seat forward of the pilot, the weight of the craft is so greatly increased that it is but little esteemed for any save the most sluggish manoeuvre. Indeed, just as aircraft, as a factor in war, have come to be more like the cavalry in the Army, or the destroyers and scout cruisers in the Navy, so the tendency has been to discard everything in their design that might by any possibility interfere with their speed and their ability to turn and twist, and change direction and elevation with the utmost celerity under the most difficult of conditions. It is possible that should this war run into the indefinite future, we may see aircraft built on ponderous lines and heavily armoured, and performing in the air some of the functions that the British tanks have discharged on the battlefield. But at the end of 3 years of war, and at the moment when aerial hostilities seem to be engaging more fully than even before the inventive genius of the nations, and the dash and skill of the fighting flyers, the tendency is all toward the light and swift machine. The attitude of the fighting airman is somewhat reminiscent of that of America's greatest sea fighter, Admiral Farragut. Always opposed to ironclads, the hero of Mobile Bay used to say that when he went to sea he did not want to go in an iron coffin, and that when a shell has made its way through one side of his ship he didn't want any obstacle presented to impede its passing out of the other side. The all-important and even vital necessity for speed also detracted much from the value of aircraft in offensive operations. It was found early that you could not mount on a flying machine guns of sufficient caliber to be of material use in attacking fortified positions. If it was necessary for the planes to proceed any material distance before reaching their objective, the weight of the necessary fuel would preclude the carriage of heavy artillery. In the case of seaplanes, which might be carried on the deck of a battleship to a point reasonably contiguous to the object to be attacked, this difficulty was not so serious. This was demonstrated to some extent by the British raids on the German naval bases of Cuxhaven and Wilhelmshaven. But even in these instances it was bombs dropped by aviators, not gunfire, that injured the enemy's works. But for the airplane proper this added weight was so positive a handicap as to practically destroy its usefulness as an assailant of fortified positions. The heavier weapons of offense, which could be carried by the airplane even of the highest development, were the bombs. These once landed might cause the greatest destruction, but the difficulty of depositing them directly upon a desired target was not to be overcome. The dirigible balloon enjoyed a great advantage over the airplane in this respect, for it was able to hover over the spot which it desired to hit and to discharge its bombs in a direct perpendicular line with enough initial velocity from a spring gun to overcome largely any tendency to deviate from the perpendicular. But an airplane cannot stop. When it stops it must descend. If it is moving at the moderate speed of 60 miles an hour, when it drops its missile, the bomb itself will move forward at the rate of 60 miles an hour until gravity has overcome the initial forward force. Years before the war broke out, tests were held in Germany and France of the ability of aviators to drop a missile upon a target marked out upon the ground. One such test in France required the dropping of bombs from a height of 2,400 feet upon a target 170 feet long by 40 broad, or about the dimensions of a small and rather stubby ship. The results were uniformly disappointing. The most creditable record was made by an American aviator, Lieutenant Scott, formerly of the United States Army. His first 3 shots missed altogether, but thereafter he landed 8 within the limits. In Germany, the same year the test was to drop bombs upon 2 targets, one resembling a captive Zeppelin, the other a military camp 330 feet square. The altitude limit was set at 660 feet. This, though a comparatively easy test, was virtually a failure. Only 2 competitors succeeded in dropping a bomb into the square at all, while the balloon was hit but once. The character and size of the bombs employed by aircraft naturally differed very widely, particularly as to size, between those carried by dirigibles and those used by airplanes. The Zeppelin shell varied in weight between 200 and 250 pounds. It was about 47 inches long by 8½ inches in diameter. Its charge varied according to the use to which it was to be put. If it was hoped that it would drop in a crowded spot and inflict the greatest amount of damage to human life and limb, it would carry a bursting charge, shrapnel, and bits of iron, all of which on the impact of the missile upon the earth would be hurled in every direction to a radius exceeding 40 yards. If damage to buildings, on the other hand, was desired, some high explosive such as picric acid would be used, which would totally wreck any moderate sized building upon which the shell might fall. In many instances, particularly in raids upon cities such as London, incendiary shells were used charged with some form of liquid fire, which rapidly spread the conflagration, and which itself was practically inextinguishable. End of Some Methods of the War in the Air, Part 1. Recording by William Tomko.